Okay.
Okay, I'll do chapter 1 because I actually took good notes for part 1. Oh, hello everybody. I forgot to introduce us. We're doing Therapy of Desire. We're on chapter 6, Immortals, Lucretius on Death, and the Voice of Nature. Pardon me. So, if we quickly say something about what we thought, I was reading along thinking, oh, I wonder where she's going with this, because it kind of got very complicated pretty quickly. And it takes a while to realize what she's doing when you on your first read through. I think I'd forgotten this chapter, but I realized halfway through that there was a lot of talk about some obviously important articles that were concerned, or chapters that were concerned with Lucretius's view of death. The Macropolis case was one of them. Another one was by Nagel. And it made me want to go and read those articles. Obviously, not having read those articles, I feel like I have to rely on Nussbaum's critique of them, probably a little bit too strongly, because I wasn't sure if I agreed with her. I felt like I agreed with her, but I'm not sure if I was doing justice to the articles that she was critiquing. What did you guys think?
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I meant to look up the Macropolis case, and I think it's a Bernard Williams article, but based on an opera by Janicek, or however the Czech pronunciation is. So yeah, I meant to look that up as well, and I'm afraid I didn't either. Shannon may have some info on Nagel, because I know he's read more Nagel than I have. But yeah, she does bring in so many other references, and yeah, you kind of get the feeling, oh, we really need to examine all these in order to get the full picture. So yeah, I totally agree, Courtney.
And my take on it was, I was interested that by the end of the chapter, she was bringing in her own idea of what would be possibly a better approach to the therapy. And so, yeah, just to have that included and expounded upon was really, really valid,
Yeah. All right. Yeah, so she obviously thought there's something missing with it. Well, Epicurus adds something that shouldn't be added, it seems like. So anyway, let's start with part 1. Epicurus writes, the correct recognition that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable, not by adding on an infinite time, but by removing the longing for immortality. So Nussbaum experiences beauty in her morning stroll precisely because of its transience. So there's a bit of a summary of this very kind of long and sexy piece of writing that she gives us. And just to a short snippet from that, a moment is itself a gathering place for 1,000 other moments, not one of which can be inhabited again. It is also composed of projects that point beyond it to moments not known. And then she goes on to say that death is terrible to us because of our experiences of joy and beauty. The thought of the end flows terribly back upon the experience of beauty, making it keener and more astonishing. I mean, all of this I'm not even sure if I agree with for a start, but it's very poetic. Having not read Lucretius, actually, maybe this is the kind of way he speaks in it. Is that right, Judith?
Yeah, so I think what she's doing here, and it's so beautifully done, she's writing poetry essentially, and paying tribute to Lucretius's amazing poetry in this beautiful passage. So yet again, she's kind of, as she did a proem in the former chapter, now she's waxing poetic as a kind of an introduction to the complex issues she's going to cover.
I actually flicked through the book on the nature of things, and the English translation, at least on the pages I stopped on, didn't really seem to have much of a poetic kind of rhythm to it. Where does that start? Is it sort of, how does it work?
Yeah, so it's very hard to convey in English Latin poetry, and so that's on at one level, and on the other hand as well, people who are reading Lucretius for the philosophical content aren't necessarily interested in the poetry as poetry. So for a couple of reasons, it has been hard to convey what Lucretius is trying to do, but there have been translations that have tried to do both, if you like, but it's very difficult. So yeah, was it a prose translation you were reading, Courtney?
Maybe it was Sedley, I think.
Oh yeah, well, that'd be prose. I don't think David Sedley has made any pretensions to being a poet, but there have been poets who've translated Lucretius. So I mean, just as we had a great time reading Boethius, maybe doing some actual Lucretius might be something we should look at.
I think it's a great idea. Yeah, excellent. So she then goes on to say, this condition does not seem to be acceptable. This condition of experiencing beauty with the backdrop of death, for example. It is an illness that must have a cure. Perhaps there is a way to freeze all of life within life, to immobilize the most important things, and to rise above this condition of abject helplessness before time, to create within mortal life some analogue of a God's non-finite completeness. Above all, not to be at the mercy of the thought of death. According to Lucretius, the love of life is natural in all sentient creatures, and so all creatures go to death with reluctance, we're told. On the other side, Epicurean gods have reflection without vulnerability, thought about the universe without anxious fear and concern. Us reflective human beings, well, us human beings are both reflective and vulnerable, and we have to suffer all that, suffer with all that brings. Lucretius's ambition is to show us a way in which reflection on death can remove fear and the sense of fragility rather than increasing them, to take us from fear of loss to a position like the gods, untroubled by change, understanding and accepting the ways of nature. So this is getting towards the end, around page 194. Nussbaum focuses on the dual aim of Lucretius's Epicurean therapy, the aim to make the reader equal to the gods, and at the same time to make him heed nature's voice. And she says that we shall see that these two aims are actually in a profound tension with one another, and Nussbaum will propose a resolution to that tension. She will also investigate Nikidian's experience of transience and beauty and say that much of the human value of human experience is inseparable from the awareness of vulnerability, transience, and mortality. And that's the end of the first part. Does anyone agree with that kind of summary? Or want to add anything that I might have quickly skipped through? Otherwise, it's on to part two. Who would like to do part two?
Well, I mean, I can do it. I'll have a go at it. I haven't written notes, but I've been learning to wing it these days, and it seems to be working okay so far. So let's do it. So what's interesting, I think, here about Nussbaum's account is that she stresses that the Epicureans really have to underline the fear of death, and if people weren't sufficiently terrified, they're going to make them more so, simply in order to recommend their therapy. And so that's what Epicurus is doing in the letter to Manichaeus. The many, that's most people, fear death as the most terrifying of evils. And this belief about its supreme badness allegedly causes disturbance that are correspondingly great. And so Lucretius puts it, that fear of Acheron, Acheron is one of the expressions in Latin culture for the underworld, must be hurled out headlong, that fear which shakes human life at its very foundations, covering everything over with the blackness of death, and which does not leave any pleasure fluid and pure. So Lucretius's complex diagnosis of this fear's disturbing effects is a very important part of his argument against it. And so just to elaborate there, some people don't admit that they're afraid of death on this view. Nikidian may be unlikely to admit that it's with her. And just as a bit of a sidebar, when I think about Roman literature in general, there isn't a whole lot about fear of death. I do want, and it's just occurred to me to wonder, well, how big of a factor actually was it in Roman culture? Lucretius obviously is at pains to upplay it, but I don't know. Certainly in the Etruscan culture, which preceded Roman classical culture, so the Etruscan cities were very powerful in Italy before the Romans took over in classical times. The Etruscans had a very strong culture of death. And so that we find with their wall paintings, they have all kinds of monsters from the underworld depicted and so on. So maybe that was part of what was going on in Roman culture that Lucretius kind of picking up on. But honestly, I honestly can't think that there's too much explicit fear of death expressed in culture.
But this point, though, right, is really central to the argument too.
Yeah,
she's going to say it's unconscious, and Epicurus's job is to really talk us into it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so maybe Lucretius's job here was harder than we might think. And I suppose it's doubly hard for us too, because we're coming from broadly speaking, the Judeo-Christian approach is to stress the dread of damnation or a future in hell. You know, that was something that was very prominent in Christian culture. So that's part of our conscious or subconscious background. But yeah, I just don't think it was necessarily as prominent a part of Roman life as Lucretius may have wanted us to think. Anyway, that's just a digression. So there's a diagnostic pattern that Nussbaum identifies, a description of a pattern of behavior that seems to lack adequate explanation. And it will be argued the most powerful explanation of these symptoms is fear of death. So yes, I mean, in a sense, whatever the symptom is, this is what it actually means. The description of a subjective condition, which although not consciously felt as fear, it will be argued that the fear of death is the best explanation of these inner symptoms. Then there's a confession or acknowledgement, a situation in which the patient, dropping her usual defenses, will grant that fear is in fact what she feels. And in the background is a normative picture of the healthy, unconstrained person whose life is not burdened by the fear and who lacks the bad symptoms associated with. So I think that's a very powerful outline she's given of what's likely to be the therapeutic approach.
And again, it reminds you of Freud again. It's always sex. In this case, it's
right.
death. And when you drop your defenses, you'll admit that you want to have sex with your mum.
That's right. And
if you refuse to, I was going to say, if you refuse to accept that you suffer from fear of death, it's because you actually have an even stronger fear of death. If we go the Freudian way, it's everything proves the theory.
That's exactly right. Denial is just further evidence of all evidence is evidence for this particular point of view. So, I mean, what we can see, and this is what we find on what page are we up to? Page 197. Certainly in Greco-Roman culture, there's fear about, or sort of bad sentiments around the death of Iphigenia, who was the daughter of the Greek king Agamemnon at Troy, who sacrificed his daughter in order to get a favorable wind to take his troops to Troy. And that was a kind of a fundamental event in culture, which led to all kinds of terrible consequences. And so then, so that was certainly a factor. But Lucretius insists that it's religious belief that builds upon groundless other beliefs, and also priests kind of play on this and take their cue and cause further problems. And certainly that was the case with Agamemnon, making the decision to kill his own daughter. And so people are led to a hatred of life with this kind of debilitating, I guess, fear in the background. And sort of what's sort of interesting on another level here is this this symptomology, you know. So if we come across people with a very negative attitude about life, we might have a different explanation. But here is evidence that there were people in culture at the time who had kind of what were thought to be pathological beliefs around and pathologically negative beliefs. And so it's Epicurus / Lucretius who is diagnosing those as caused by a fear of death. It's really interesting that sort of the symptomology there. So, and this description at the top of page, sorry, from 197 to 198, he's giving a description of someone who's suffering in this way. You know, he can't get any relief anywhere. He rushes around. He's no better outdoors than indoors. He can't make decisions, or he tries to sleep all the time. And of course, we know that we would identify someone who just wants to sleep all the time. Well, yeah, they've probably got some issues there. Or he runs back to another setting. Thus, each person flees himself. But in spite of all his efforts, he clings to that self, which we know he can never succeed in escaping, and hates it, all because he is sick and does not know the cause of his sickness. What an amazing passage around mental disturbance. Maybe I'll stop there for a second and get some commentary.
This second part, you know, there's first the fear of religion or whatever, the fear caused by religion. Second, the fear of death. This second bit is the bit she makes the most mileage out of, I think, here, because this is the stuff that she really milks, and it's hard kind of to follow in some respects, because she's saying that the fear of death interferes with the enjoyment of such pleasures as mortal human life does offer. And she's making the point that for Epicurus, this is really a big deal. And she quotes him as saying, banishing this fear is important in order to make the mortality of life enjoyable. He shows us two people who, like you said, they never find satisfaction in activity, since no activity succeeds in gratifying their thirst for immortal existence. I mean, if that's true, if that's what Epicurus is seeking to treat, and his treatment is to have us kind of act like indifferent immortal gods, then maybe she's right. Maybe her analysis turns out to be correct, if that's in fact what Epicurus is trying to do. Because as she says, you know, the gods aren't temporally embedded in the world, and the world is a kind of mutable thing that's ever changing, ever transient. And in fact, all our human lives and values are embedded in that experience. We wouldn't even know what gods would think like outside of a temporal structure. So yeah, she makes a really strong point that I think she's really starting to focus on already at this second point. Do you guys think so?
Yeah. But and even at the bottom though, again, are you down near the bottom of 197? Is that where you are? Because because you're talking about number 2, the fear of death interferes with the enjoyment of mortal human pleasures. Well, there's a line I wrote that is the unconscious nature of the disease is a large part of its destructive power, just bringing it back again to the unconscious part, the unconscious facet of it, you know, so that's brought up again, you know, the fact that it's destructive in that way through the unconscious. Yeah,
that's a great point, Jodie, and she underlines that just on page 198 after that big quote. She sort of identifies that. Notice here that Lucretius is claiming that the unconscious nature of the disease is a large part of its destructive power. Awareness is already progress towards cure. So yeah, that kind of underlines her pretty bold claim in earlier chapters that that Epicurus discovered the unconscious. I mean, this kind of really lends some support to that, I think. Okay, so then we've got our more more common symptoms of wrong life, where people want to just accumulate wealth or a blind lust for honors and power. And these are the kind of the surface symptoms, but they do, we're led to believe, have their subjective side. People have this desire or this uncomfortable feeling, but they, I'm not sure what is it displacement in sort of psych theory, is it that they put it onto other activities. And again, this is really kind of beautiful observation, I guess. So as she says on page 199, Lucretius has advanced a forceful theoretical hypothesis that might well convince the pupil just on account of its simplicity and its power, but this is not the full extent. And then but then there's more. It's more in times of danger that one can really look into a person and know in his adversity who he is. But then at last the true voices are drawn forth from the depths of the breast. The mask is torn off, the fact remains. So there's this idea that it's in a crisis that people will admit or finally come face to face with this fear of death. And Nussbaum references this. It's not a Platonic dialogue, or it was thought to be Platonic for a long time, the Axiarchus. Sidebar, first Platonic dialogue translated into English, which, as I say, is now not thought to be Platonic. But Axiarchus has spent most of his life denying that death is bad. But on the point of death, he is right up against the fearful thing, and his brave and clever arguments steal off and breathe their last. Which is quite a contrast, we might add, with Socrates, of course, who on the point of death had no particular fear, and his behaviour wasn't at all altered in that situation. So 3 parts of the diagnosis: outer symptoms, inner symptoms, and moments of acknowledgement, are now drawn together by the explanatory hypothesis. It's our fear of leaving life and its good things that produces so much evil and distress. So Nussbaum says we should view this hypothesis with some sympathy because of its plausibility and because of its complex argument. And so going on, she emphasizes it's important to grasp the relationship of the diagnosis to the religious beliefs it criticizes. And so, and this is quite an important point, I guess, because as she says, Lucretius' arguments are in fact often portrayed as if their target were religion alone, and if a sufficient cure for the fear were a rejection of religion. But as she stresses, the text refutes this. So Lucretius is not putting forward any kind of atheist argument in the pure sense. But then he goes back to a kind of an origin story. In some distant ancestral past, much like the ancestral conditions of our theorists today, by definition, a period that we know nothing about, nor is it much more common then than now for mortals to leave the sweet light of life with laments. So he's pointing to, again, like our theorists today, much more of an animal existence where people didn't have some of the fears that people have today. Indeed, he later argues it is men's perception of their own vulnerability before death and the perception that the gods lack their own weakness and fear, mortis timor, that is one of the primary causes of the invention of worship and religious subservience. So then Lucretius goes for more origin stories. This is on page 201. Some more hypothesizing about prehistorical people. But emphasizing that the fear was there as a direct response to the natural love of life and to our human sense of life's beauty and value. And thus, in extinguishing fear, Lucretius cannot claim simply to be returning human beings to some uncorrupted pre-religious condition, or, as in the case of love, to be undoing deep religious or cultural constructs. He must acknowledge that he is attacking a deep and fundamental part of, quotes, natural human life, a part closely related, as he himself stresses, to the structure of the human sense of value. And it lies deeper than any particular culture. And so we can just note in passing that the Stoics had a somewhat different take on what I take to be exactly the same hypothesized phenomenon, which is So the way the Stoics put it was that every organism has a desire to continue its existence. And it seems to me that's actually a simpler and a more kind of intuitively plausible account than whatever Lucretius and Epicurus were doing here. But in any event, his arguments would not even remove religion, since its underlying causes would be left in place. His therapy must also deal with what Plutarch calls the longing for being the oldest and greatest of all forms of eros, which is kind of a bit more like the Stoic view. And in dealing with this longing, they must focus above all on our relation to the things we love and find delightful, for our fear is above all a fear of losing, as Exarchus says, this light and the other good things. Fear is a response to value.
Yeah.
And this thing here about eros again, I think the whole way through you see this psychic surgery analogy is again, it all sounds very Freudian all the way through, because I think it's in the background, it's working towards psychoanalysis. He's obviously interested in it. And it says, because we've got the unconscious already. And obviously Freud is deeply interested in eros, the erotic libidinal force that, is this deep, what do you call it, deep well of motivating power within us. And Plutarch, that comment about Plutarch, the longing for being the oldest and greatest of all forms of eros, this sounds kind of like so much like that Freudian theory again. And I was going to say something a bit more about that. Oh yeah, I was going to say it's interesting because it's almost like Freud is very well acquainted with this theory, and he's found what Epicurus's positive view of the world kind of ridiculous, and rejected the positive view and instead makes eros a negative energy in a certain way. It's kind of unrestricted, uncontrolled power that needs to be controlled and sublimated and repressed in various ways. Otherwise, it's a destructive, aggressive impulse, that kind of stuff, will to power. But he's also made it philosophically more realistic, at least against the backdrop of his Victorian era, in the new science and Nietzsche and all those sort of characters. It lacks some of the philosophical problems that Nussbaum's pointing at, that Epicurus seems to have in trying to make the client, the patient, immortal as part of the therapy. See, Freud would never do that. Freud is obviously damning man to a world without religion and also with no recourse to immortality. In fact, all of his human projects are doomed to fail. And this is the negative view. Doesn't matter what man ever does, he'll always feel incomplete in some way and dissatisfied. I'm just pointing at that because I feel like that the picture of Freud is so just beneath the surface all the time. Yeah.
Interesting. Do you want me to do number 3? I can read you my notes on 3 and then we can discuss anything from there.
3, yeah, go for it.
Yep. So Lucretius, we're on page 201, the start of 3. So Lucretius shows it is irrational to fear death because, and I've numbered these off. Number 1, so this is also in Epicurus, where Epicurus's argument is that an event can be good or bad for someone only if, at the time when the event is present, that person exists as a subject of at least possible experience, so that it is at least possible that the person experiences the event. What he's saying there is basically the person needs to be there to experience the experience, They can't be absent. They have to be there. So that leads into the second part of the argument, that the time after a person dies is a time at which that person does not exist as a subject of possible experience. So, he's claiming then, therefore, after death, the person isn't existing. So they can't have experienced anything. 3, that hence the condition of being dead is not bad for that person. right? Because they're not experiencing anything. And 4, it is irrational to fear a future event unless that event, when it comes, will be bad for me. We're on page 202 now, sorry. Yeah, we've gone over to page 202. Number 4, it is irrational to fear a future event unless that event, when it comes, will be bad for me, for 1. And number 5, so the outcome of this string of argument is that it is irrational to fear death.
And she calls this the mirror argument a few times. Because it seems like there's a mirror between being nothing, then living, and then being nothing, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So this, I just wanted to quickly point to this being something that Socrates explicitly gives in the Phaedo, and I think in other places as well, although I can't think where at the moment. So it looks like Epicurus wasn't very generous about attributing Socratic origins to a lot of his positions, but I think they must have been. A lot of these positions seem pretty Socratic, and I think this symmetry argument, if you like, is certainly directly from Socrates.
Yeah. Okay, so if we go over to page 203, Nussbaum then talks about 3 supplementary arguments. So she's saying here that the symmetry argument, which is closely related to the first, this idea that you've just been saying, that the time before we were born, we suffered neither good nor ill, and after we die, the same applies. We cannot suffer good nor ill after we die. So yeah, that symmetry argument is related to that first argument. Then Lucretius has nature saying that life is like a banquet, and it has a structure in time that reaches a natural and appropriate termination, and its value cannot be prolonged far beyond that without spoiling the value that preceded it. So, you know, this finite nature of the banquet, and there's no point it going on and on and on, because that will ultimately spoil the good of the banquet in the height of the you know, the good part of the banquet. It can't just keep continuing. So this banquet argument comes up again. And then 4, nature also says the population argument. So this is this argument: if there are births and no deaths, sorry, if people just keep getting born and born and born and no one dies, then the world would become unlivable, you know, obviously because of pressure on resources, etc. So that's we're up to page 204 now. We're up the top of page 204. Did you want to stop there, or we keep going? Who wants to do 4?
I can quickly do 4. This one, my notes get sketchy. So Epicurus' central argument has been in recent years the subject of intense philosophical debate, and that's what she's going to discuss here. So he's saying basically there's basically a lot of intellectual work done on this argument. On the whole, these recent interest has focused their attacks on premise 1, which is the symmetry argument, isn't it? Is that right? But there is little agreement about what is wrong with this premise, or about why the fear of death is, after all, rational. For Thomas Nagel, the problem lies in premise 1's focus on possible experience. He argues that a person is not simply a subject of experience, even possible experience. I'll kind of skip ahead here because I wasn't sure where she was going with these arguments at the start. Does anybody have a good summary for the Nagel argument that they'd like to share, rather than me try and read through it?
Well, I wrote a couple of sentences. I wrote, Thomas Nagel, problem with premise 1, focus on possible experience. A person is identified by his history and possibilities, and good/ill can occur to him outside his awareness. So, for example, either through betrayal or accident, and the example he uses is that he could live without knowing he has lost his mental faculties, like he's living like a child or a moron. That there is that loss of possibilities. So death is bad as it removes fulfillment of possibilities and is a termination of something underway. That's what I wrote there. But as Nagel says, how do we determine what possibilities were frustrated? So at least he admits that, you know.
Yeah, and this
like
is
what,
the
you know,
idea that she calls it a strong and interesting argument, right? It moves in the right direction when it asks us to look at our person's whole history and the trajectory of that history through time, and to see death as a termination of something that was underway, projecting toward a future. So she thinks that's pretty good.
and there was that little bit about the spore. Sorry, go on. Sorry, Courtney, go on.
No, you tell me about the spore.
Oh, no, and it was just another example that he used that was waiting to hatch, was prevented from fulfilling its possibilities. So that's something that says before birth. That was sort of an example from before birth. But, you know, it's a bit of a thin one. And then
comes the Macropolis case, right? Bernard Williams.
Yes.
So she's changing tact here, because the Macropolis case is sort of making its attack in a slightly different direction. She's got, although Williams does not discuss the symmetry argument, his argument is well equipped to handle it. The unborn have no desires for fulfillment, a fortiori, no categorical desires, and so the badness of death is not to be found in the case. See if my notes make sense. Lucretius's answer would certainly be that one cannot defend the rationality of one's desire by pointing to its intimate relation with another desire, unless one has already established that this desire itself is rational and worth keeping. If both are irrational, therapeutic argument could just take for itself the larger task of removing them both. All right, that doesn't help me very much. Did anyone have anything more on the Macropolis case they'd like to say?
Yeah, I wrote a little bit. Assumes that the satisfaction of desires is good, but not all desires are conditional on being alive at the time. Relevant. Yeah, on being alive at the time is relevant to satisfaction. Sorry, what's that mean? Categorical desires propel an agent on into life, explaining his willingness to continue living. So that is so in the light of suicide arising, these desires cannot be contingent upon continued life, and death frustrates the fulfillment of those desires. Yeah, sure. Yeah, we get that. I think what the point was being made with this linking of desires, you know, that you couldn't isolate a desire out by itself without it being attached to other desires.
Yeah, because part of the Epicurean stance is that you can just deal with desires as one-off kind of experiences, but she's saying, well, no, they're not. They're projected off into time. Like, we do things because of their long-term consequences or meaning for us, like child rearing and stuff like that. She talks about a little bit, doesn't she?
Yeah, I wrote the unborn have no desire. Sorry, this is on page 206, down the bottom of page, getting down 206. The unborn have no desires for fulfillment, so no badness of death exists in their case. But are their desires essential to human life? But are their desires essential? Yeah, so what are desires are actually essential. And Williams argues, yes, there are essential desires, but does not show them to be good or rational. So that wouldn't meet the Epicurean critique.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what she's doing here is probably very ambitious, which is trying to summarize all the arguments around around death and life in a few pages. So it's very ambitious.
It would have been neater, I think, if I had a bit more time to kind of summarize the key points of each one of what she was trying to say. That's where it gets complicated, because next comes David Furley, right? And in his one, he suggested a somewhat different and promising way of looking at the badness of death in its relation to the life that death terminates. She says, She gives a bit of a description again and says, any death that frustrates hopes and plans is bad for the life it terminates. This is down the bottom of 207, because it reflects retrospectively on that life, showing its hopes and projects to have been at the very time the agent was forming them empty and meaningless. Our interest in not dying is an interest in the meaning and integrity of our current projects. Our fear of death is a fear that right now our hopes and projects are vain and empty. So yeah, what I'm doing right now with this book club could be a complete waste of time because I could die tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose what it goes to show is there is a range of really interesting and probably promising approaches to this very problem, inspired by Lucretius's treatment. So, yeah, I mean, the fact that we're not in a position at the moment to kind of decide what's the most plausible is I think that's fine, everyone. I think we're all good. we'll just carry on.
And broadly speaking, I guess she's kind of sort of say she agrees with a mixture of the critiques, right? That, and especially this idea that that human values aren't really satisfied moment to moment in singular desires, but rather we live temporally, stretched out. Our activities kind of encapsulate our desires, and they kind of extend temporally into the world. And that makes a lot of sense, right? It doesn't make sense to think in terms of this immortal God. But then I guess the thing is, do you think Epicurus really meant it like that? I mean, it seems to be that he did, the way it's presented, but it seems really feels like bad philosophy, doesn't it? I don't know.
Well, I think what's coming out here and in sort of other things I've been reading in for other things is what actually is it to imitate the gods? You know, how are we even in a position to know what it is to imitate the gods? That's I think part of the problem here, and I think it's part of Epicurus's problem and part of Lucretius's problem. And she does touch on this later on. You know, how do we even know what it is that the gods that we are imitating when we're imitating the gods? So yeah, I think that's part of the problem.
But she's trying to say that the gods are definitely unconcerned, right, and completely indifferent to human affairs, and somehow we should kind of conduct ourselves that way.
Yeah, there's a line there at the bottom of 209, where she's been talking about you know, the temporally extended structures, you know, that strengthen and deepen over time. So she's gone through all the love and hope and grief and virtuous activity and just and courageous acts and intellectual and creative work and athletic achievement and delight in seasonal changes and beauty, you know, like, wow, you know, and you just think, yeah, all the wonderful things of life. And then down at the bottom of 209, so she's got a quote from Lucretius. This project to form new projects is what Lucretius links with the ungrateful nature of mind. So this whole idea of being ungrateful, the ungrateful nature of mind.
You know,
that's something. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. The thing that gets me too is, I guess the thing that makes me agree with this is I've actually met people who get really, really heavily into, say, Buddhism, for example, or those kinds of practices. I'm not saying everyone, and it's obviously a very specific reading. And they will look you in the eye and go, don't you know, it's all not real anyway. It's all an illusion. So I'm going to do nothing. And they have this really dopey, vacant smile on their face. And they and I know someone, hopefully he doesn't watch this, but he lives just like that. And we have this conversation periodically where he says, why do you go out in the world and help people? And I'm like, because I think human beings are real and their suffering is real, and I'm here and I don't want to waste my time. I'd like to do something meaningful with my life. And his response is entirely like complete indifference, you know, like it's not real. Their suffering is an illusion. Nothing's real. So, and I'm like, yeah, but if you believe like that, what gets you out in the world? What gets you out of bed in the morning? And he's like, nothing. There's no reason to get out of bed in the morning. And this is the kind of thing that if Lucretius is saying that, yeah, I have a real problem with people like that. I find that really irritating, that view. And I find that an annihilation of value, of real human value.
Yeah, that's sort of like radical skeptic position. It's just I have like similar feelings that you do, Connie, where it's just I don't really understand like what they're actually arguing for, because it's just so destructive of like everything else. But it's like, no, that doesn't actually exist. It's like, what? I don't understand what the hell you're on about. But like just on that line as well, like with the Buddhists, like I always think about this, that like when I'm gonna get possibly wrong, but I think it was in Japan, they had the Buddhist monks were basically like telling the soldiers during World War II that it's okay to fire the guns because you're not actually killing the person. It's actually the bullets that does it. So it's completely disconnected from you. And I always think about that because like I think like this is like going off on a tangent. But in the West, we kind of have this view of like, oh, you know, the Buddhists, they're so cool and loving, and they just want to go into the mountains and smoke weed or something. But it is like all religions that can have that support of the state apparatus of like whatever needs to get done, the justification can be found.
Yeah, can I offer another kind of extreme case? This is a real tangent, I'm sorry. So in the 18th century in Philadelphia in the United States, the Quakers were very prominent. You know, they ran the businesses, they were very influential. And of course, the part of the Quaker ethos is that they are opposed to war and very pacifist. But Benjamin Franklin gradually realized that as long as you had some kind of intermediate goal, and they were also against gambling, but they were okay to put money into projects that were like one step removed from armaments. So he took full advantage of that, and that's why, and he got involved in a whole lot of projects, essentially with the Quakers of Philadelphia, which were like one step removed from arming the populace. Because he realized that there was that gap between the theory that they were completely pacifist and the practice. So yes, 100%, Shannon.
Yeah, or you can have like the early Christians with borrowing money, like that whole thing as well, where it was like, I think, though I'm not as familiar with this, but I think Islam, some parts of Islam also have this, where there's like this, you sort of end up with these weird borrowing laws. It might also be Jewish beliefs as well. Yeah, where you just end up with these weird convoluted borrowing laws where it's like, no, we're not borrowing money, we're not paying interest, but like, I'm going to give you this gift to your second cousin, and they're going to pass it on to their, do this, and then it's, you know, God will be okay with that. Like, that's completely, this isn't a loan. It's completely different.
But it's loopholes, isn't it, right? You know, there are loopholes. Yeah. Whether it's divine or human law, there's going to be loopholes.
All right, who wants to do part 5? I seem to have highlighted the whole text for some reason. I hate highlighters. I just do not know how to use them properly.
Well, I can do a quick skip through and then we can see if there's anything of value. Would you like to do that?
Do that.
All right. So 212. So Epicurus' critique of the above, what we've just been talking about, and we've already mentioned it, the values are false values, that the wise Epicurean will not link with these values that death is a loss, but will identify completely with godlike pleasures without a temporally extended structure. So we said that. We said that before. So yeah, so true pleasure is not additive, is what his point is. There's no point in having more of something. Once ataraxia and aporia are attained, the agent is at the top of life. So Epicurus denies time brings increment to the highest good, and that was in Cicero. But this does not show that it is not better to be able to choose a valued activity again. So, for example, having children, writing books, etc. But for Epicurus, pleasures are complete in a moment. So, healthy, undisturbed life is the end, the goal. And Nussbaum argues that intellectual work involves a temporal sequence of stages. So she's saying, well, hang on a minute. You know, even your own process of explaining and arguing is something that happens as a sequence of stages. It's something through time. And Thurley also points out to secure expectation of future freedom from pain, which is their idea going into the future, is also a temporal idea that they have an expectation of going into a future without pain. But anyway, 214, we're up to 214. Epicurus gives us new values. So true pleasures do not project forward in time. So termination of death is exactly symmetrical to threshold of birth. The tension between perspective of nature and perspective of God, there's this tension there, a big tension between the two. And he doesn't ever seem to get above that. And Nussbaum argues that quite a lot. So, you know, so live as per nature, but this suggests terminating at one time rather than another, you know, so that idea of the fact that, you know, what is the proper length of life, basically, what's the right length of life, and suggests the value of life derives from its place or part in the sequence. And remember the quote about here, she gets us to remember the quote about the beauty and sweetness for the individual, again, which has got to be linked with time. So then that brings us to 215. But if Epicurus and Lucretius both urge us to leave mortality behind and live like the gods, well, there is an appeal to divinity, an extra human goal. And so the Epicurean gods live without grief, change, need, gratitude, or anger. And Epicurus himself desired passionately to burst through the narrow confines of the gates of nature. So this fighting against nature again, this aiming to be with the gods. Each thing has its power bounded and its deepest boundary stone. Therefore, religion is abased and trampled underfoot, and he makes us, with his victory, equal to the heavens. That's Lucretius's quote about Epicurus's discovery. I think Epicurus had a deeply mystical experience. I think he had I reckon something happened for him. He had a really deeply mystical experience, and he was trying to bring it back and convey it to people, and had great difficulty in doing so, really, in trying to convey it, you know. So I'll just finish off 215. The true Epicurean learns nature's boundaries, and at the same time, she is enabled by Epicurus's victory to move beyond them. We need to bound ourselves off from the time. We need to bound ourselves off from the time-bound desires of mortals, be completely self-sufficient. Lucretius talks about a mix of mortal and immortal. The grasp of the whole takes the knower beyond the mortal condition. So Epicurean science is transgressive. What does that mean? What's he trying to say there? Epicurean science is transgressive. It gives a bounded being knowledge of the whole and teaches her to care and see in such a way that she is no longer bounded. Anyway, that's taken us into 217. So that's pretty much the summary of that section. So
you could imagine that if Freud, for example, has this will to desire, then later on it's critiqued by Adler, who's interested in the will to power. So in a sense, Epicurus is the will to power gone mad, right? Because he's got this idea that we're limited in our power to be happy because we're restricted by what nature has done to us with our desires, basically. And the only way to seize back that power which rightfully belongs to us is to reject our human mortality and become divine. And through that we become these otherworldly powerful beings. If that's true, it just sounds like pathology. But anyway,
it's like the Nietzschean Superman, Ubermensch,
yeah.
Ubermensch.
So, yeah, and the Stoics did sometimes talk very cautiously about, becoming like the gods. So Seneca does it, but he knows it's a bit edgy, whereas the Epicureans are right out there, So yeah, it's an interesting contrast. But I'm going to have to sign out now, so I'll catch up later.
Okay, Judy.
Thanks. Bye.
I'll see ya. Oh, what a shame.
yeah, I was just going to ask Judith about, I think it appears in Seneca. Hang on a second.
Have a break if you need it.
No, I was just going to say that it's in Seneca, isn't it, where he's reflecting as a consolation. He used a similar argument that appears in the symmetry argument. He says, death is probably nothing to be afraid of because it's a bit like what it was like before I was born, and that wasn't something terrible. And that's very similar to the symmetry argument. But I was going to ask Judith if it's in Seneca. I believe it is, but maybe I got to tell.
But there's also in Seneca quite a few, well, not that I've read all that much Seneca, but I see it quoted here and there where he talks about this idea of us being higher than the gods because we have to deal with our temporal mortality and the fact that we have so much more to deal with, and the gods haven't got, the gods got it easy and we've got it so hard. And our challenge to operate with virtue and to live and strive towards a goal of virtue is, and the fact that we actually strive and work in towards that goal of virtue, it puts us at a height which is above or equal to the gods. I'm sure I read that the other day in a letter of Seneca's. I can't remember where it was. Have you read that before, Courtney? That idea of his that we are pretty amazing for the fact that we strive against the challenges that the gods don't have. That
yeah,
idea,
I do recall that.
The idea of the hero, the heroism of human heroism of that.
Yeah, and I know what you're referring to, because there's that line that in that particular letter where he says, and we become greater than the gods in doing so. But I can't remember which letter.
Yeah, no, neither can I.
One of the popular ones.
It's either one we've done recently or something. Anyway. Yeah.
Where are you up to now in the text?
I am finished 5. So if you want to, is there anything else you wanted to say about 5? It was just really that idea of that striving to be immortal and and to be like the gods.
Well, that sounds good. Do you want to do 6? And I'll do 7? Yep,
I can belt through 6, no worries. Okay, here we go. 6 is starting on page 217. And it says, I've got, an enormous revision of human patterns of desire and value is required. We should alter evaluative judgments to give us correct account of a mortal good life. So what Nussbaum says here, doesn't this just feel the same? Isn't this just like the same old longing for transcendence? So, finding a home in this worldly detachment. So being so detached from the world and finding a home in it or being comfortable in it. But really all you're trying to do is live in a state of transcendence. That's why I keep thinking he's had some really full-on mystical experience, because he's really into this transcendent state all the time. 2 arguments in Lucretius book 3, on top of 218. So 2 arguments that are used by Lucretius is number 1 is basically that mortal values are self-defeating and therefore unnatural. And 2, he asks the reader to view life and death from a perspective of the whole natural universe. So that sort of view from above, in a sense. And for that first argument of mortal values are self-defeating, he goes on to explain the 4 errors of those mortal values, and they are: 1, treating life's valuable things like commodities, so that idea again of that more is better, and this can lead to boredom. So several other forms of corrupt evaluation, for example, like erotic love, lust for power. Nikidian can never fill the ungrateful nature of the mind with good things and satisfy it. For example, pursuit of earthly beauty and value. We can hold on to, can we hold on to some of this beauty and value is the question that Nussbaum states there. We're on page 219, top of page 219. And Nikidian says, Nikidian will be induced to see her cherished pursuits as risky, difficult, warped, perverted, and therefore true Epicurean detachment is where true human value is found. So this full-on detachment, idea of detachment, which is so Buddhist, you know.
You see, it's funny that you see it as he's had a sort of transcendental experience, because I see it as somebody who really takes serious that argument of 2K versus techne, which Nussbaum outlined in chapter 2 or 3, where she says, you know, the philosophers are well aware that misfortune can strike at any moment. And if you rely on external things as sources of value, you're going to be severely upset in life. And he knows that very clearly that if he lives like other mortals live, then he's going to have this kind of life that he's outlining. He's going to be disappointed in love. He's not going to be able to enjoy things, and things can all be taken from him, and he's going to die anyway, miserable. So I just see it as a kind of, you know, the pessimistic view is seeing it as a sour grapes attitude, where it's like, okay, well, fuck material things. I'm going to take refuge in my own soul. But I think it's actually a really fascinating project that these philosophical schools take on, not because it's transcendent, but in the sense that it's this elegant psychological move to detach oneself from external things and instead look for internal causes of happiness over external causes. I think that is just brilliant. What a clever strategy. Yeah,
it's definitely that is the nature of this whole passage,
because this whole thing suggests that a group of people, the philosophers, realize clearly that there's 2 forces that affect us and our lives. One's external and one's internal. And if you could completely decouple your attachment to external things, then what can stop you from being happy? Yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, I just see it as practical and psychological.
It does lean into the Stoic. It does lean into the Stoic arguments. It does, of detaching from external things. And then, but Nussbaum then argues, though, it doesn't have to be so extreme. She sees all of that as being really extreme. And she says, towards the bottom of 219, that like the description of a good loving relationship where it is not self-negating, like we saw in that other chapter, but develops over time, and which does indeed make the lovers vulnerable to loss. Okay, so
and this is really the problem. It
doesn't have to be extreme, but it could be still.
Yeah, and this is the problem with Epicurus's particular version of detachment from external things is that, well, just enjoy them for what they are right now and not extend them into, temporally into the world. That negates so much of human value, is what she's saying. But the Stoics don't do that, and that's why I think she will have a different argument for the Stoics, because the Stoics see things growing in the world in a much more organic way, that, like relationships are part of that oikiosis, that the kind of concern that an organism has for other organisms that are part of the same body. That's something that's extended in time and growth over, and much more natural in a sense.
Exactly. And she then goes on to 220. We're at the top of 220. And she goes on to explain the same with political activities, like, for example, just laws, and the improved well-being of the city and its citizens, and and then many other activities as well. So Nussbaum asks, can a changeless being respond to beauty? Which is a good question. So and then she brings in that example of the Danaids. How do you say that? Do you know, Shannon or Courtney? The Danaids, who are the maidens that are trying to hold water in a sieve. They're trying to hold water in a sieve, is the story. Anyway, this is the top of 221 now.
But you know that story about the Danaids, or whatever they're called? It's pity Judith's not here right now.
Yeah, I know.
Because it's very similar to the Socratic argument given in the Gorgias, where he's whinging about he's having that argument with, is it Callicles, about the guy with the leaky jug. It's a similar thing. And he's saying, Callicles is saying, or is it Socrates? Socrates is saying, the man who's addicted to pleasure is like a man with a leaky jug. He pours the water in and he's got to constantly keep topping it up because it's running out all the time, just like in the imagery of this. I'll have to ask Judith about it next time she's on.
Because in that 221, because she goes on to say, talk about hunger and sexual desire and the return to it, which is enjoyed. The beauty is enjoyed because of its transience, the whole moving and changing of it. And it seems that living in accordance with nature is to value life's goods in their transience. So
in a way, that's Callicles' argument, if I recall, from the Gorgias. He says the pleasure is in the filling up of the jug, the constant appetite. You keep doing it, it's really enjoyable. That's the purpose of life. And Socrates is sort of saying, no, it's not, kind of thing.
Yeah. So Lucretius says, we're still on 221, but Lucretius says a pursuit has true value only if it can detach from change and vulnerability. So their argument is going to the other, totally opposite, isn't it? So it's only got value if you can detach from that change and vulnerability. So then we can go on and talk about the other argument, which was asking the reader to view life and death from the perspective of the whole universe, right? So this God's eye view of nature from the then we can talk about that argument. So Lucretius has deep intolerance of nature and temporality, which Nussbaum sees as hatred of mortality, which is what Epicurus is supposed to be curing, is her point. So nature's voice, still speaking in the poem at this point. We're on 222. We've just gone over to 222. Nature's voice is still speaking in the poem. And the viewpoint of all living things, present and future, like our own anxieties, our own viewpoint, feels small. So we should contemplate and care for the whole. So that sort of view from above that Marcus always brings in, that we should always be trying to see how small and tiny and, unimportant we really are.
Yeah, it's a very similar image. She says here, contemplating and caring for the whole, we are ashamed to be wrapped up in ourselves, and the shameful obsession is itself dissipated by the engrossing interest of the reflection in whose light it is revealed as shameful. as George Santayana summarizes this part of the poem,
Yeah.
one who lives the life of the universe cannot be much concerned for his own.
I love that quote. I think that's just amazing. What a great line. What a great line.
Yeah, it is a good line.
Mm.
We should get it tattooed.
Our death is necessary for the continued health of the whole, and clinging to life is selfish and callous to other beings, right? The world's resources are not limitless. And then she makes the crack about university professors should step down and let the young ones step up. Oh, that was really funny. So this argument is for deeper love of life and change, and reduces the sense of injustice at the time of death. So you accept it, the fact that, you know, you have to let it go. You have to let your life go. So Nikidian may ask, why should she not be the exception though? Why can't she just stay alive and everybody else die? So she must consider herself one among many. This is on page 224. Just the top page 224. She must consider herself one among many instead of self-promotion and cowardice. And she brings in Euripides' character Admetus as an example there. I've written it in. I can't remember what it was about. Was it anything important there?
Oh, before you jump ahead,
yeah.
on 223 though, where you were
Yeah.
talking about the strength of the argument. She says it's a strong argument, this objective view of the world from above sort of thing.
Yes, yes.
But she's saying also that it's a good example where you see the tension between the desires of the part and the requirements of the whole. Because she keeps addressing this tension that comes up in the Lucretian version of Epicurus's philosophy, because the other tension is played out in the banquet imagery, isn't it? That it's extended over time, whereas the ideal Epicurean sage doesn't care about values extended over time. Everything is satisfied in the moment.
So yes, indeed. So 224, top of 224. So modern society has aims of reduced birth rate and prolonged life. So she goes on a bit here about modern society and tries to bring in, you know, sort of what's happened in contemporary society, so that you know, we have aimed to reduce the birth rate, but that's only after a huge explosion of population anyway. Like, they had no concept of that back in classical Rome, that the world, they could not foresee such an explosion of population over the whole world, and the way that we can now prolong life, you know, through our healthcare and the amazing things we've discovered.
But I think her point here, of course, is that the symmetry argument doesn't work, because when you listen to the voice of nature, we have to be concerned with things beyond ourselves.
Exactly. But she made a really weird point here, though. She got really off track, I thought, because she talked about this idea that the possible freezing of population raises new moral problems. But, you know, because we need the stimulus of intergenerational relationships. But even if you did only allow babies to be born as people died, even if you did that, you've still got young people coming into the world, and you've still got intergenerational relationships developing. So I wasn't quite sure where she was going there.
I think part of it is because my understanding very generally is that she's referring to something in the Macropolis article.
Right.
It's something that appears in more detail in one of the articles she's sort of critiquing.
Okay.
I think the character in the story is like, I'm not even sure, but basically is like frozen in time or something.
For 300 years at the age of 42. Right?
Yeah, there you go. So hence this idea of frozenness and what it would do to us as a human being, like that we need to be transient, that we fundamentally are embedded in time, sort of thing.
And the character ended up committing suicide anyway, apparently.
Oh, there you go.
In the story, yeah. So this would be inconsistent. And she says, well, so that lack of, you know, that kind of society would be totally inconsistent with Nikidian's own upbringing. Well, of course it would be. And mortal temporal values are affirmed by this argument of Lucretius's. So, mortal temporal values. This is on page 225 before we hit section 7. This bit about this would be inconsistent with Nikidian's own upbringing. And I've written mortal temporal values are affirmed with Lucretius's argument. So I don't know what I was getting at there.
Not sure.
No.
You're going really well. Do you want to keep going?
Yeah, look, I can if you don't mind. I mean, it just helps. If it helps us to get through it in time, because it's such a big.
Yeah, and your notes are better than mine, trust me.
Well, I jump quicker, that's all. And so please don't forget to pull me up if I miss stuff. So 7. Okay, so we're at the page 225 still, but we are not yet persuaded that fear of death is irrational. Okay, so with everything that's gone before, they still haven't really argued for us that it's the fear of death is actually irrational, or that the values attached to this fear are not genuinely good. So the values are good that we attach to this fear. So 226 now, the removal of death, Nussbaum says, we would remove the value with the removal of death, Nussbaum says we would remove the value of life as we know it. So Nussbaum here explores mortality and human value. So this is where she starts really strongly bringing in her own argument, you know, where she starts to really put forward her own ideas on what would be good therapy. And again, she brings us back to Bernard Williams, the Macropolis case. Janacek's heroine lives for 300 years, always at the age of 42. She commits suicide. She's isolated in a mortal world. Okay, so that's the example.
And you know, all the vampire stories you ever read are like this too.
Yeah.
They're always about these. Do you remember Interview with the Vampire?
Yeah.
There was this whole thing about Louis was from the New World, post-industrial world or whatever, and the older vampire Lestat wasn't, and Lestat could never change to adapt to the changing times. So he needed Louis as his consort because he wasn't able to adapt to the values of the time.
Yeah. So that whole thing of where they're drifting through locked, their own temporality is locked and everything else is changing.
And they feel like at least in the vampire story, on the outside they're these romantic creatures, but actually their own experience of the world was a nightmare because they're frozen, they're never changing, they're not able to value things, whereas everything else is constantly moving and changing and dying. It's kind of it's interesting. It's a plausible kind of argument, sure.
Yeah. So 227 we're up to. So imagine an immortal human with no childhood, but can feel pain. So for example, in Homer, the Olympian gods are frozen, immortal, anthropomorphic adults, right? So they're like us, but they're immortal and they're frozen in time. So every risk is removed by concerning time in that predicament. So they cannot have courage. They don't need courage. They cannot have courage like us because acting and reacting, they don't need to act or react in the face of death, which is a lot of the origins, the reasons that bring out our own courage, really. So that component of love, friendship, love of country that consists in willingness to give up one's life for another must be absent. The laxness and lightness in their dealings with each other. You know, must be very playful, very unheroic.
I had a question mark about this. Pity Shannon can't talk because I'd be curious about this. I think it's not the fear of death which causes this problem for the gods in particular, and I think the same could be said for us. And I think Epictetus kind of makes a very good point of it. He says it's what's intolerable to us that matters. So, you know, you can get gods that in the stories fly into a rage because some injustice has been done to them, because it's intolerable. You know, there's something that they consider irrational, should not happen. It's against their rules and principles. And human beings have that all the time. Do you know what I mean? Like maybe that's a bit of a tangent, but to me that seems like, I don't know, that seems like a really important thing.
That the gods would have their own laws or moral values that would cause them to.
You'd imagine that gods like
jealousy. Well, they got jealous. They were
that's
jealous.
Right, because it would be intolerable for someone to take what belonged to them, right?
Yeah. So they still had that. And I know that their childhoods were very quick. So, because when the babies were born, they just became adults very quickly. They didn't really have a childhood. I just remember that.
Even though the gods can have anything whenever they want, they can still be afflicted by these things like, like you say, jealousy.
Jealousy.
They can hold things intolerable.
Yeah. And in their hierarchy of power, you know, if someone was trying to usurp someone else, or, you know, there was always conflict in those areas as well.
And sometimes courage is described as the knowledge of what should be endured. Well, the gods don't have courage then, in the sense that they would not endure the loss of their own power. So where they can't have what they want because another god has taken it and they freak out.
So there is all that.
I think that does qualify, for me at least, as a loss of courage. But here, courage is not really a thing that they
or
need
maybe
to be concerned
justice,
with.
maybe more justice.
Yeah, maybe they're all very closely related, though. You know, moderation. Well, they're not moderate, are they, when they freak out like that?
So 228. So she says, so if there's no warrior, there's no Achilles, basically. Virtues require a knowledge of limits, is her argument. You know, if you're going to have virtue, you've got to have some sort of limit to gauge it against, what you're pushing up against. So moderation is also required. Justice is necessary for survival, because in justice, you know, there's a sharing of resources, which in the human world, we have to share resources. We have to cooperate and share resources. You know, we've got to help each other. You know, we have to encourage fairness. And then she's got a quote here from Aristotle, who said that the idea of debates about justice and contracts among the gods is a ridiculous idea. Okay, that's on bottom of 228, or middle. Is a ridiculous idea. So that was from Aristotle.
So this kind of only works if the gods are Epicurean gods, right? They're indifferent towards human society and human concerns.
Yeah.
And that's where I guess I'm getting mixed up, is because I was thinking more Homeric gods, because the Homeric gods obviously care about civilization and society and human affairs. But if we were, you know, human beings were to act like these immortal gods, these indifferent gods, then they would not be paragons of virtue. They wouldn't be the kinds of things that you'd look up to for instruction on how to behave in a virtuous way. Is that right?
Yeah. Shannon.
Would you agree with that? Does that make sense?
Can you not talk, Shannon? Is your line not working?
Oh, it's occasionally like getting bad.
Drops out.
Yeah, but I'm also like really tired from uni, so
Oh, okay, that's all right. Okay, no worries. Yeah.
yeah,
So
sorry for not
anyway,
talking much. Just yeah, my brain is locked.
that's all right. Thank you for being here at all, really. So yeah. But anyway, so and then she says personal, family, and social relationships must be changed as well as a result. Child rearing, care of citizens, all that stuff. It's all got to be different. So relationships are shaped by growth and change and process. Acknowledgement of change, of fragility in the beauty of nature, and it makes sexual desire more interesting, apparently. So there you go. And intensity and dedication with which human activities are pursued is because they are finite. The gods are finite, dead and closed. Oh, yeah. So, right. So, sorry, I'll just finish that. The intensity and dedication with which human activities are pursued is because they are finite. And then she puts in that quote by Heraclitus, where Heraclitus says, gods are finite, dead and closed off from the value and beauty that we see. So Heraclitus is claiming, again, like that idea in Seneca, you know, that we are able to, as humans, we're not closed off from the value and of the value and the beauty that we see in life, in our human life. The gods are therefore finite. That was a quote from Heraclitus.
I
What do you
think with
reckon?
Seneca, it's like that they're already fulfilled or whatever, or fully virtuous, and we have to strive to overcome adversity in order to get there. So we go so much further than the gods ever can, right? In that sense. But the interpretation here in the Epicurean kind of interpretation of Heraclitus, if that's what's going on.
No, I think she's just using that Heraclitus quote to show what it did, like
there's an
was having a
affinity.
dig, that he was having a dig at the gods. That Heraclitus,
Yeah, that's right. And Heraclitus is that's right. But it's sort of a parallel to the kind of gods that Epicurus seems to follow. These gods that aren't capable of caring about anything. It seems like.
Yeah, I think you must be right there. Not necessarily the Homeric pantheon. Yeah. Anyway. Okay, so we're still on 229, but we can't really imagine or know such a life. Of course we can't. And that's what Judith was saying early on, you know, like we can't even, and you were too, you know, we can't even imagine or you know, pretend that we would know what it would be like to live such a life as the gods, but our values would be absent in that life. But our values would have to be absent in that life. Yes, of course they would be. The enduring that is inseparable from transience and motion in the poem by Wallace Stevens. So then she goes and quotes that great big long poem, right, by Wallace Stevens. And I wrote the enduring, like the enduring of time that is inseparable from transience and motion. That the enduring, not of time, that our values can't be separated from transience and motion.
Yeah, I think the quote is, her attempt to imagine enduring value cancels, paradoxically, the very sort of enduring that she prizes, the enduring that is inseparable from transience and motion and from her own awareness of her own transience.
Of her own transience, yeah.
And the poem goes, death is the mother of beauty, hence from her alone shall come fulfillment to our dreams and our desires.
But she still feels the need for some imperishable bliss, with death as fulfillment. I've written. So it must have been the bottom of page 230.
Yeah.
I've written her own sense of her finite time, her own awareness of her own transience, but she still feels the need for some imperishable bliss.
Yeah, so there's something.
With death as fulfillment.
Nussbaum's critique is obviously that there's something about the fact that we are mutable and that we die that gives our lives the kind of meaning that our lives have. And that if we were going to try and tinker around with that mortality and project ourselves into some sort of immortal state where we disconnect from very human values, then we would somehow impoverish our lives, most likely.
Yeah.
And the kind of thing that Epicurus is talking about is beyond imagination anyway. It's not the kind of thing that we could ever try to understand, because we wouldn't even have the ability to imagine it, or, she says here, understand the structure of that kind of language. What a language of being that is outside of time, for example. It wouldn't even make sense to us.
No. So 231. So the graceful motion of life against the void that contains no motion. The light appears as light against that darkness. Nikidian will see the pain and fear and embrace it along with the delight, for they are connected. In fearing and avoiding death, Nikidian will not condemn the whole condition of mortality itself, or imagine the gods as superior in worth. If Nikidian should die prematurely, then she would have rage as well as fear. But if she lives a long and full life, she would have less negative emotion. So that brings us to the top of 232. So this is this thing getting back again to, okay, if you live a really long life, you get to a really end of a really long life. You're not going to be so bitter and twisted about dying because you've had a full life. You've had the whole banquet, you haven't missed out on much. Yes, if you still have a few plans left, you still might be a bit pissed off, but ultimately, if you cut short, it would be worse. That's what it's getting into here. So it says, but she still lives a long, full life. She would feel less negative emotion. But if she still has plans in place, she would feel fear. This argument should investigate other limits as well, like pain, disease, accidents, need for food and drink, vulnerable babyhood. All of this is a truly naturalistic therapy for the fear of death, along with the population argument. So she's happy to use the population argument and this other idea of
and the banquet argument.
Yeah.
But the symmetry argument seems to fall down, right? Is that the idea?
Yeah, well, she doesn't seem to refer to it, does she?
She says, she seems to think that it doesn't fit with the medical analogy very well. It doesn't treat the individual and improve their life in a way that would be meaningful in a human way.
Yeah, I think you're right there. So that's why in section 8 then on 232, she does start talking about that. But these arguments do not banish all fear. And Lucretius argues that the fear of death must be completely banished, or it will cause many bad consequences in human life. Will these appear in Nikidian's life if she chooses to listen to Nussbaum's revised therapy? I wrote. Well, that's what Nussbaum asks as well.
Did you summarize the bad consequences of the fear of death? Were of 4 kinds. Do you want me to quickly list them? Dependence on religion, inability to enjoy other pleasures, culminating in extreme case in a total hatred of life, pointless, frenetic, and anxious behavior, together with a subjective feeling of great weight or burden, and finally, various forms of harmful and immoral behavior aimed at seizing a kind of worldly immortality in the form of money, power, and reputation. These categories are closely related. Religion, for example, is condemned not only because it is false and irrational, but also because it makes us hate our human activities and inspires various forms of immoral action. Immoral behavior further increases fear of the gods and therefore in turn our dependence on religion. Fanatic behavior is prompted by a desire to flee oneself, thus by a hatred of our merely mortal existence. Thus it is closely linked to the inability to enjoy. Yeah.
You happy to keep going?
Yeah, keep going.
You can. No, I mean you. Do you want to keep going? Do you want to finish this section?
Oh,
Or do you
okay.
want-
I've just got some chunks. It's a bit of a summary, yeah. So just in summary, because this is the last section, isn't
Yeah.
it? Subservient to religion in Lucretius's persuasive analysis was prompted not so much by the fear of death as by the belief that this fear is a weakness and that the gods live better because they live without it. By inspiring in Nikidian a love of the fragile and the human in human life, a love, however unstable and uneasy, of the very limits that separate her from godlike beings, the revised therapeutic arguments ought to work against the turning to religion, making it possible for us to live where we are with joy rather than hatred. So that I like that because I agree with that.
Where was that, Courtney? Was that on page 2? What was that on page?
233
Yeah, 233.
in the middle.
Yes. Yeah. That's a big page. That's a huge page, 233. I had heaps of notes from that one page because there was a lot on that page.
So in a way, she's just saying that if you revise the argument like she did, you don't need religion. You can get rid of the things that kind of, Lucretius was getting rid of without having to go and make the person an immortal god.
She's saying to appeal. She's trying to reintroduce that appeal to nature.
Yeah.
She's trying to get us to lean more towards that argument from nature rather than from,
She's saying the immortality thing from Epicurus leads to too many problems and is already in a tension with that nature argument.
Yep. And she definitely leans towards that idea that we can temper our fear of death through that acknowledgement of our finitude, and to see how beauty and value is enhanced by that very finitude.
And it makes sense, right? If you somehow find a way therapeutically to accept death and not be afraid of it, it doesn't mean you have to imagine yourself immortal, but like you say, be able to enjoy each day as one less day, She says much the same can be said of the relationship between fear and her other pleasures and activities, because Nikidian does not connect the fear of death with a weak or bad condition. That's what we're talking about.
Where are you now? Where are you?
Bottom of 233.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't have to be a condition to be transcended at all costs. She will not let it cancel her joy in the various beauties that human life contains. Indeed, she will observe reflectively, as previously she did not, how deeply the joy and the fear are interrelated. And she will therefore not be inclined to turn aside from her pleasures in an anxious search for an end to fear. Here again, we might say that this therapeutic argument does better than Lucretius's own, for he requires Nikidian to turn aside from most of her previous values, pleasures, and activities in the name of godlike life. And she says this shows us a further reason why our critical argument must be concerned with value as well as with structures of desire. For only a defense based on value will reveal how much Epicurus has in fact diminished Nikidian's life. And if you remember, part of her criteria for a medical analogy was that it had to improve the quality of the patient's life. In a way that was like meaningful and felt by them to improve it.
Yeah, exactly.
So it looks like Epicurus's argument is undermining the value of human life.
She knows, it's a 234. at top of page 234. So she loves, she knows herself and her limits. She loves her limits. The revised therapy is better, whereas Epicurus permits us to hate and flee ourselves, even though he promises a secure and peaceful destination away from other mortals. Nussbaum will not strive for complete ataraxia, but she will be motivated to undertake harmful actions as she still has pain of her own finitude. So she won't be perfect. She'll still fall down. She'll still err. She'll still make some bad choices or decisions based on her what survives of her fear of death.
And presumably her loves and her failings and all that sort of stuff will be more poignant and more meaningful and have more power to them because they're distinctly human loves and human lives that we're talking about.
Admits her therapy. Nussbaum admits that her therapy is evaluative, not just descriptive. So yeah, she's got a very it's based on values, isn't it? Very heavily based around value.
Yeah, and values that are distinctly human and life affirming, not just like you say.
But then she says
description.
And then she says on 235, it must include scrutiny, though, of the value of money and power in human life, which are not only prudentially unsound, but aim for a form of immortality in themselves. Why do we strive for power and wealth? It might be, in a way, a pursuit of immortality.
This is something she doesn't deal with, I think.
No, she doesn't go there.
Unless I forgot about it,
no, it's not. She doesn't really go there.
Because the reason why Epicurus is probably doing this is to disconnect from external things, by becoming this indifferent godlike thing. If we do what she's saying, we somehow embrace life and accept the fear of death, we can still have all these external things and be deeply involved with them and run all the risks that the Hellenistic schools were worried about. It's the Stoics that will come along and give us a kind of a different way of approaching external things. Rather than disregarding them with complete indifference, we have a preferential indifferent relationship with them instead. We can have them but not obsess about them. But this is interesting on 235, because then it goes on to say, note that the fear of death aids our sense of self-preservation, and this is overlooked by Lucretius, and that's true. He doesn't go anywhere near that idea that it is our fear of death that actually keeps us alive. Just through that sense of preserving, that automatic self-preservation instinct that drives us all. Well, there's some kids that are born with a disorder where they don't feel pain, and they usually die early. They get their fingers chopped off, and they bite their tongues off, some of them, because when they're like toddlers and they grow teeth, they just chew on their tongue because they can't feel it. It's messed up.
And she brings in Rorty. That wrote about animal fear. Because how he goes back to the animal and the baby as the model of everything. So, and that's true, right? Because that wasn't much reflected on that, that animals have that fear, that same fear, that same self-preservation instinct, And then she also says about Plato's Diotima, where she talks about in the Symposium, mortality stimulates desire.
All the human
to beget value.
These include the creation and rearing of children, the creation of works of art, the creation of good political conditions and systems of law, the creation of ideas and scientific or philosophical inquiries, in short, the creation of all worldly beauty and value that expresses the creator's own identity and in which she can, in a specifically human way, live on in the world after her death. Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think, if I recall, in that speech by Diotima, how you say it, that's the reference to the ladder, isn't it? The ladder with the on the lowest rung is the kind of personal loves, and then it goes up into the love of law and the love of
I
the
haven't read
forms.
it. I haven't read it, Courtney. It is on my list to do very soon. I have to
Wow,
cover it soon.
very, very good.
Mm.
And
But
that
there is
section, sorry, that section with Diotima, when you read it closely because it's very cryptic.
I will. I'm nearly there, nearly up to it. To symposium. But there's this thing here where Nussbaum also says on 235, before we go to 236, where she says, but Epicurus values political communities, family and friendship and freedom from pain. So Epicurus cannot see this as morally irrelevant. This whole, like, so all of those things that he does value, he does value political communities because he's living in one, for goodness sake.
Yeah, well, that's right. And again, I wish Judith was here because she's often saying that there were worldly Epicureans who were involved in, military affairs and things like that. And if they were, according to this at least, taking seriously this godlike attitude, then they wouldn't give a damn about politics and
that's
political
right.
life.
So, it's a little bit, yeah.
It doesn't really work, does it?
No. And then you listed all those. Oh, hang on. So then Lucretius also omits the good ways people seek immortality through, and yeah, you listed all those. Yeah, you listed all those ways that people do seek immortality. And then on page 236, Epicurus must reject all of this. The only thing that counts is the immortality of the single moment's godlike thought, and look at all things with a calm mind. Even human suffering, for example,
Yeah, that seems to be what is being suggested.
Yeah.
Which is antithetical to human value.
Yeah. Because I was just, it's very hard, even using our Stoic principles as deeply as we possibly can. It's still hard not to identify with other people's suffering and to feel
we wouldn't want to deface our humanity that way.
No, and especially in those close to us, it's impossible not to feel their pain and to feel empathy for what they're going through. You just can't not.
But if you were modeling a completely indifferent God, which the Epicurean therapy seems to ask for, then it becomes meaningless. That's the idea.
Yeah. So Nikitian's fear and discontent, her love and concern, will motivate her towards the creation of human value. So Nussbaum is saying Nikitian can't help but create human value. It's just part of everything that she does. Everything. Nikitian seeks continuation in history and nature by her contribution during her life, by our own noble drive to help others. We're actually trying to improve our environment and the people around us. We're trying to help. We're trying to give aid. We're trying to, be of use. And that's basically a temporal thing, isn't it? It's got to be based in time.
Yeah, it seems like we're born into the world, into this history, into this whatever temporal life, and we can't act like we can get outside of it. And to attempt to imagine these otherworldly abstracted God figures that we might copy seems like, from this sort of psychoanalytic reading, a complete denial of what it means to be human.
So Epicurus, this is 237, we're nearly there. 237, Epicurus's godlike perspective, standing above and beyond mortal troubles, gives no reason to be involved in the world, and so cannot heed nature's voice to care for the whole in the present or the future. What a great point. That's so well done. Lucretius, as poet, alludes to fellow feeling and to leave a mark on human life, and longs for appropriate praise from the muses for good activity.
Yeah,
and helping others, which doesn't fit Epicurean detachment. So yeah, like it's hypocritical in a way. I don't want to be that harsh and say hypocritical, but it's just that it does seem to.
I think what she's saying too is that, we've spent 3 chapters on Epicurus or something, is it?
And we've still got another one to go. We've still got to do anger. We've still got to do.
Epicurus was a very talented psychologist, really, and he was able to deduce so much about human nature and discover the unconscious, but he fell into a very pernicious trap, it seems, and that is the feeling that one could overcome all of these human frailties and vulnerabilities if they could somehow reject their mortality, which she's obviously unpacking, is despite all of his really good points, leads to a kind of self-denial, a denial of health, in a sense, a non-normative kind of way forward.
And I think that was part of that sort of criticism that we were sort of bringing forward before about Eastern religion, the Buddhists, and because they can tend, like you said with your friend or whatever. But I don't want to criticize the Buddhists because I've read a lot of Buddhism, and there's a lot of good stuff in it. But that idea of that idea of being outside of this reality, to me, doesn't wash. Really doesn't wash. No. And so this last bit, the tension between the voice of nature, and that of godlike transcendence, which cannot be sufficient for a good human life. So that's how she ends the chapter. So she's basically summed it all up in that very last sentence, really.
Well, we finished with 3 minutes left to spare, according to my
clock. My gosh. Yeah, so wow, look, thank you for doing all this, because I know that, it's been my intention to read the book thoroughly and to study it. And the fact that you've been happy to come along and reread it again. Wow.
Oh, I love it. It's a great book.
It's really nice. And Shannon, to have you here, and Judith, is just great. Obviously, there's not many others of us really want to do this, but
we're halfway through now.
Yeah, we are. And we've still got another chapter of Epicurus to go.
No, you've been expert on Epicurus.
Yeah, which is fine. I don't mind, because it's been a really good education.
If you like this sort of thing, read Christopher Gill's book, The Hellenistic Self.
Yeah, I've got it. You uploaded it. I've got it.
It's really good. It's dense, though. I'd like to go back and read it, because it treats the Stoics and the Epicureans together, examining their similar approach to exploring a holism as opposed to a kind of part-like universe.
Well, they are seen as probably being closest amongst the Hellenistic schools. They were sort of often associated with each other just through certain similarities.
Yeah, their physics is different, but some of the psychological things are similar. So yeah, if you like this and you're coming off the back of a decent amount of knowledge, you'd probably jump into that other book quite easily.
The Gill one.
Yeah, the Gill one.
Yeah. And I've still got to read Graver's book, and I've still got to read.
Yeah.
But this was a real little. This was just such a great little find. This is just was such a. It is such a good little summary of.
And if you read that, you'll notice I keep coming back to that in my own comments.
Well, this is where I don't know whether. Well, you'd already studied Foucault, but of course he uses Foucault as his jump-off point. The care of the self.
Because that comes from Pierre Hadot. See, Hadot makes the same kind of comments.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I have spent time with Zen Buddhist meditation and training and all that sort of thing, which is exactly what they talk about in this. It's just exactly the same thing. So I can really feel that it's a really genuine comparison. Like, it's a great comparison.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I can
Well,
see the merit. I can see the merit in our Stoic approach.
yeah, absolutely. Distress management or philosophical education. Yeah.
It's great.
Well, my good friends, I'm going to leave you to it.
Yes. Thank you. All right.
Oh, I did want to ask you. Can you end the recording? Oh, I might have to wait till I click end. Anyway, I was going to ask you, has anyone started the Descartes reading?
Look, I have got a commitment with my family on Saturday night for my son-in-law's birthday. So
Yeah.
I am unfortunately going to be missing.
Well, maybe we can pause it because I haven't started it.
Yeah, well, I haven't started it either.
Have
you started it, Shannon? Yeah.
Yeah.
How far are you?
Oh, probably like 3 pages. I've read it before, but yeah.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
I wanted
it's good.
in the next
It's really
couple
good. It's
of
very
weeks.
easy to read.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Oh, good.
So it
Good.
shouldn't
Well,
take
like
that long.
easy, you know,
I want to do
relatively
one
speaking.
in a couple of weeks because I downloaded a bunch of Schopenhauer and and I
okay.
found a very short essay. It's very short.
Which one? Because I'll have it.
It's called it's from what's it called? It's from his studies in pessimism.
Yeah.
And it's basically on misfortune, basically. It's a perfect contrast to Seneca's On Providence. It's like a perfect contrast. So I want to do one topic on Seneca versus Schopenhauer, and we read both short essays on Providence and this one on misfortune, because they're both pretty short. And it's
great.
like they just riff on each other, they're like the opposites. Like there's a line in the Schopenhauer one where he's like, if you think that life is pleasure or whatever, or not terrible, just imagine two animals where one's eating the other one alive. It's got stuff like that in this gold. Because obviously
I came across that quote in something I was reading.
Yeah, because obviously Seneca's like, oh, everything's bearable, and he's like, well, not if you're the animal getting eaten by another one.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right, guys.
But, Harry Frankfurt died.
Did he?
On bullshit.
He died.
He died last week.
Did he die on bullshit? Or
I don't know.
He choked on his own bullshit.
oh, okay. So it was on and in bullshit.
Actually, Jody's just talking bullshit.
No, I was reading some of his stuff because I was doing in another group I was in for a while on compatibility, compatibilism. Yes. Anyway, and he was a big spokesman on that. Anyways, I better let you guys hang.
Adios, my muchachos. Right. See you later.
So Saturday you might pull a pin. You might. You don't know.
I'll see what other people say. If Shannon's read it, if Shannon smashed out his 3 pages, I better jump in.
You got to do it.
All right. See ya.
All right. Good night.
Yeah.
Good night.